Job gains and unemployment down to 4.1%. Inflation slowing, dropping to 2.4%. That's the lowest rate since February 2021. Will it all make a difference for Americans who usually vote pocketbook issues in presidential elections? Well, joining us to share his thoughts is Phil Kerpen. He's president of American Commitment. Phil, James Carville said it's the economy, stupid. So how important is the economy in this election? How will this news affect voter attitudes about the state of the economy?
Well, the economy is almost always the top issue. And I think this year it's definitely the top issue, even for more voters than usual, because of the harm caused by the weak economy, and particularly the high inflation that we suffered in the 3.5 years of the Biden presidency. And there have been some good news headlines, it's true, but you kind of look beyond the headline in some of these economic reports, and there's still a lot of cause for concern. I think that the Federal Reserve moved more aggressively than expected on interest rates because they are concerned that we may be headed into a recession. It's easy to look at 4.1% unemployment and say that's good, it's low, and it is pretty low, but it's up significantly. We were at 3.5% last year, and once it starts rising, it does tend to continue rising. Now, this most recent unemployment print that we got, it was down from 4.2 to 4.1, but all of the jobs that were added were in the public sector, federal, state, and local government. If you take the government jobs out of the picture, unemployment actually would have risen to about 4.5% last month. And so we're sort of the economy. You look at the GDP number, 3% growth. But how are we paying for it? By accumulating an awful lot of debt, both national debt at the federal government level, but also a lot of household debt. And the fact that prices have risen faster than incomes have risen for so many households means you get towards the end of the month and you face that tough decision. Do I go without something? Do I make my kids go without something that we used to be able to afford? Or do I put it on a credit card and carry more debt? And I think a lot of households have sort of propped the economy up by, kind of bridging that gap between rising prices and incomes lagging by putting things on the credit card. And that's why we've seen those balances rise dramatically, and we've seen delinquencies start to rise. And so, yeah, the economy's kind of continued to move and continued to grow, but there's an enormous amount of economic anxiety about the debt that's propped that up and about the fact that prices have still risen faster than incomes have.
And once prices go up on consumer goods, I'm thinking mostly groceries here, they rarely come back down to previous levels. And Kamala Harris wants to put some price controls in place to stop price gouging. I remember in 1970, I'm sure you do, Richard Nixon put a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to bring down inflation, and that didn't seem to work too well. So what are your thoughts on the idea of price controls?
Well, price controls have been a disaster every time they've been tried anywhere in the world. It's a recipe for empty shelves and long lines and food riots. I mean, we've seen this story before in many different places. Of course, the Harris people will say, hey, we just want to crack down on gouging. These are not price controls. But once you say that gouging is prohibited, once you say that charging excessive prices is prohibited, you've got to define what an acceptable price is and what an excessive price is. And very quickly, it devolves into outright price controls. And so I think that her proposal is extraordinarily dangerous. We're not seeing unusual profits. There have actually been studies on this. There was a Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco study that looked at profit margins as we saw this run up in prices, and they found that profit margins were very normal. This was a product of too much government spending, the Federal Reserve printing the money, and that's what drove up the price of everything. And producer prices actually rose before consumer prices, which is to say, it wasn't that there was this great opportunity, hey, we're going to gouge people and make a ton of money. It cost more money to produce all of these goods, and that got passed through, that got passed on. And so really the fundamental impulse behind all this inflation we had was too much government spending. Of course, Kamala Harris was the tie-breaking vote on the two gigantic spending bills, including that big $2 trillion American recovery plan that was passed right at the beginning of the Biden presidency, when their own liberal economists like Larry Summers were warning this will be an inflation bomb, and that kicked off all of this. Of course, the reason inflation is moderated somewhat is we've had a Republican House for the last 2 years that said no.
Well, how about Trump's tariff plans? Many economists warn that could balloon the deficit. We know that during Trump's presidency, the deficit grew by about nearly $8 trillion. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I definitely think that the tariffs are a potential concern. Large U.S. tariffs and then global retaliation was one of the key ingredients behind the Great Depression. So I think it's a dangerous game that President Trump likes to play. Now, that said, I do think that it is a negotiating tactic with Trump. He uses the threat of tariffs to extract concessions from other countries. And it was the threat of tariffs on Mexico that led to the stay in Mexico policy and stopped the flow of migrants across the southern border. That was very successful. I'm not sure that you get much of an improvement if it is the Democrats. The Biden administration has expanded all of the Trump tariffs that were put on China. And in fact, tariff collections under Biden are much higher even than they were under Trump. And so I'm not sure that we get a very good trade policy from a free market perspective from either of the major party candidates. I think the big difference is with Trump, you get them used strategically as a negotiating tool. And with the Democrats, they don't seem very good at negotiating. And so you may just get them put in place and get the downside of them without that potential upside.
Okay, we'll see which way the voters go. Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment, thank you for sharing your perspective. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.